What kind of society considers it acceptable for parents to examine newborn babies and immediately decide whether they deserve to live or should be abandoned? What culture develops religious ceremonies in which 12-year-old children are forced to take part in collective sexual rituals as a rite of passage? What people create traditions where widows are required to lie with their dead husbands' corpses for 3 nights prior to the funeral? Imagine that you get to know the Vikings through series such as Vikings on the History Channel, Hollywood films and video games that portray them as honorable warriors. Imagine that your view of this culture comes from romanticized depictions showing Vikings as barbarians with hearts, brutal yet fair, violent yet respectful. Now imagine discovering that there are genuinely documented Viking traditions so disturbing that historians, producers, and writers deliberately omit them to avoid shocking audiences. The truth about Viking traditions that nobody mentions will completely destroy the romanticized image you have of this culture. What I am about to reveal here is documented in Icelandic sagas, archaeological records, and accounts from Christian missionaries. We are talking about Scandinavia between the 8th and the 11th centuries, when Viking societies developed not only navigation and warfare techniques, but social and religious traditions that would far exceed what any modern civilization would consider acceptable. These were not occasional practices or aberrations. They were institutionalized traditions, regulated by specific laws, and regarded as fundamental for maintaining Viking social order. When you watch modern representations of Vikings, you see warriors who respect women, protect children, and follow civilized codes of honor. The documented reality was a society where women were transferable property, where children were disposable goods, and where honor included crimes against humanity. The Vikings who have reached us through popular culture are sanitized, edited, and romanticized versions created for mass consumption. The real Vikings practiced traditions that Hollywood producers would never place on screen because modern audiences would not be able to psychologically process them. These traditions were not hidden secrets or rare rituals performed by extremist cults. They were everyday practices regulated by specific laws, celebrated at public festivals, and regarded as necessary to maintain the favor of the gods and community stability. They included forms of violence, abuse, and dehumanization that would make practices of societies we consider barbaric appear civilized in comparison. But this was only the beginning. What you will discover about how Vikings truly treated newborns, about the initiation rituals children were forced to endure, and about marital traditions that turned marriage into a legalized form of abduction, will reveal that Viking culture was systematically cruel. The Viking practice of utburdur was codified in specific laws that regulated when and how parents could eliminate newborn babies. The Gulating Code, recorded in 11th century Norway, established that parents had exactly 3 days after birth to decide whether a child deserved upraising. Babies with deformities, twins, or born during periods considered unfavorable were carried into forests and abandoned to starve. This was not an emotional decision made by desperate parents. It was an administrative system regulated by laws specifying appropriate places for abandonment. Archaeological excavations at Trelleborg, Denmark, uncovered more than 40 infant skeletons buried in designated areas outside main cemeteries. The Viking slavery system, based on thralls, went far beyond forced labor. Thralls were absolute property for any purpose, including sexual entertainment, primitive medical experimentation, and ritual sacrifice. The Egil's saga records how families kept thralls for recreational use. But that was just the beginning. Viking marital practices included traditions that today would be classified as legalized abduction. The concept of husfrilla allowed Viking men to acquire wives through kidnapping, provided they followed specific rituals. The abducted woman was kept in isolation for 3 months, during which she was prepared to accept her new status through food deprivation and psychological coercion. The Frostathing Code documented specific prices for compensation for marital abduction, amounts that families had to pay to legalize forced marriage. Abducted women had no right to refuse the marriage once suitable rituals had been completed. Women were transferred like material goods. Eric Bloodaxe kept detailed records of his 17 wives, including 8 who had been acquired through husfrilla and 3 inherited from deceased relatives. The practice of munder, the bride price, was not symbolic payment, but a real commercial transaction where families bargained to transfer ownership of women. Values varied according to age, appearance, household skills, and reproductive capacity, assessed through physical examinations conducted by community-appointed specialists. Halfdan the Black established specific markets in Uppsala, where men could trade wives who did not meet their needs for more suitable ones. Women had no rights to participate in these transactions or refuse the transfers. These civilized practices were only preparation for even more extreme traditions. The Viking ritual of blot was not limited to animal sacrifices as modern portrayals suggest. Accounts by Adam of Bremen document human sacrifices. 9 human beings were sacrificed every 9 years during festivals dedicated to Odin. Victims included slaves, prisoners, and community members. The concept of voluntariness in Viking human sacrifice functioned through systematic social pressure. Families were informed that gods requested a member. Refusing this honor resulted in social ostracism, property confiscation, and loss of communal protection. It was blackmail disguised as divine favor. During the Uppsala blot, victims' bodies were hung on sacred trees for set periods to allow spirits to separate properly from the flesh. Christian visitors reported that sacred trees remained decorated with human corpses for months, creating landscapes of permanent reminders. The male initiation ritual called berserker subjected 15-year-old youths to psychological transformation processes, including forced drug ingestion, isolation in forests for weeks, and mandatory participation in ritual combats where death was a possible and accepted outcome. And that was not the worst. The Nordic version of sati funeral tradition forced wives to be burned alive with husbands' bodies. The Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan witnessed a Viking funeral in 922 where a slave woman was voluntarily sacrificed after being ritually raped by multiple tribe members. Ahmad ibn Fadlan documented that the slave selected for sacrifice was kept in constant intoxication for 3 days, being repeatedly raped as spiritual preparation. The system of NID, ritualized dishonor, allowed Vikings to publicly humiliate enemies through practices combining sexual violence with mutilation. Victims were forced to adopt feminine positions during group rapes conducted in public squares, with entire communities watching as entertainment. Practices of NID included public castration, insertion of objects into body cavities, and permanent marking of bodies with dishonor symbols. It was a systematic destruction of human dignity elevated to the level of public spectacle. Ragnar Lodbrok institutionalized annual competitions. Young warriors vied to see who could inflict the most pain on prisoners without causing immediate death. Winners received honorific titles from the gods. The tradition of holmgang, ritual combat, forced personal disputes to be resolved through duels in which losers' families were enslaved by victors. It was a judicial system based on violence that ensured only the most brutal retained property and rights. But all these traditions were merely reflections of an even more disturbing reality about the true nature of Viking society and its deliberate romanticization. The disturbing truth about Viking traditions that nobody mentions is not that they were lost to history. It is that they were deliberately omitted, a cultural conspiracy involving historians, Hollywood producers, and modern Scandinavian governments to craft a marketable version of Norse culture. In 1958, Kirk Douglas starred in The Vikings, the first major Hollywood film on the subject. Studio documents reveal systematic censorship. Screenwriters had full access to original sagas, but received instructions to retain only heroic elements and remove practices that might offend Christian sensibilities. The Swedish government created in 1962 the Committee for the Preservation of Nordic Heritage, which officially promoted cultural tourism, but in reality functioned to suppress publication of archaeological research documenting more extreme Viking traditions as restricted academic material. The History Channel's Vikings series underwent a similar process. Historical consultants were instructed to focus on inspiring aspects of Viking culture. Michael Hurst, the show's creator, admitted awareness of much more extreme Viking traditions, but chose not to include traumatizing elements. But the deeper reason for this romanticization goes beyond commercial considerations. Modernized Vikings serve as symbols of primitive masculinity. Western societies use them to compensate for anxieties about the loss of traditional values. The real version would destroy that psychological function. The video game industry followed the same pattern. Assassin's Creed Valhalla had a development budget of $200 million, but presents Vikings who respect women, protect innocence, and follow moral codes that would be completely foreign to true Scandinavian culture. Scandinavian universities receive specific funding for research that promotes positive understanding of Nordic heritage and avoids sensationalist interpretations. It is institutionalized academic control that ensures certain truths remain buried in specialized archives. The disturbing reality is that Viking traditions were logical. They were logical expressions of a culture based on absolute power, in which strength determined rights and compassion was seen as dangerous weakness. A society that truly functioned according to principles that modern societies claim to admire: brutal meritocracy and absolute individual responsibility. The disturbing traditions of the Vikings that nobody mentions reveal an even more uncomfortable truth. Perhaps we do not romanticize Vikings despite their practices. Maybe we romanticize them because of those practices, but we need a sanitized version in order not to admit our real fascination with absolute power without moral limits.